For the past 10 years, my wife Paul and I have been supporters and investors in FDD. I can't be more proud of the work that Cliff and Mark and the entire FDD team has done on so many important issues, over the last 10 years in terms of making us more secure. I'd like to welcome everybody to this afternoon's discussion titled Failing States, Rogue Actors, Sworn Enemies. With the landscape shifting in the Middle East, it is not only Washington's allies who must adjust, some of our adversaries and enemies also are now changing strategies. Take Iran. For years designated as the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism, it oppresses its own citizens, its illicit nuclear program threatens the entire region and world. The United States is now negotiating with Iran. We must hope that those negotiations will be successful, but we also must worry that they may end in failure, or worse, perhaps we might be victims of self-deception. In Syria, 3 years ago, there were peaceful protests against the Iranian-backed regime of Bashar al-Assad who responded with brutality. Neither the U.S. nor Europe was willing to support the nationalist groups against him. In fact, I remember at the FDD forum 3 years ago, members of the Free Syrian Army kind of saying, there's a window here, guys, this is the time. Well, before long, most of the fighting was between Assad's troops and its Iranian and Hezbollah allies on one side and by al-Qaeda-linked groups on the other. In recent days, some of the more moderate groups have been receiving some assistance, but the outcome of this conflict remains highly unpredictable. We are joined today by 4 experts, each with a unique perspective on our subject today. Mark Dubowitz, to my left, is the Executive Director of FDD, where he leads projects on Iran, sanctions, non-proliferation, and countering electronic repression. He's testified before Congress and advised the U.S. administration and numerous foreign governments on the issue of Iran sanctions. Next to him, Ruel Mark-Garect is a senior fellow at FDD, former CIA Iran targets officer, and a prolific writer and speaker. He focuses on Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, terrorism, and intelligence. Ambassador Frederick Huff is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East. In 2012, President Obama conferred on Ambassador Huff the rank of ambassador in connection with his new duties as special advisor for transition in Syria. Previously, Ambassador Huff advised Special Envoy George Mitchell on Arab-Israeli negotiations. Dr. Bruno Tertre is a senior research fellow at the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique, the leading French think tank on international security issues. Throughout his career, he has held positions with NATO, the French Ministry of Defense, and the RAND Corporation. Dr. Tertre was a member of the foreign policy and defense teams of the Hollande campaign for the May 2012 French presidential elections and continues to advise the French government in his personal capacity on foreign and security policy issues. Our moderator, Indira Lakshmanan, is a senior correspondent for Bloomberg News, covering U.S. foreign policy from Washington. A veteran journalist, she's traveled with the Obama, Clinton, McCain, and Romney campaigns and has reported from more than 50 countries in Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, and Europe. Indira, I now turn the floor over to you.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone for joining us. I'd like to, the title of this panel is compelling because it begins with the question of how do you define rogue actors and failed states? And I think that for the purposes of this audience, it would be great if we would focus on Syria and Iran, but at this point, no discussion of rogue actors would be complete without also touching upon Russia. So I think we're going to get to that too. And so if we start with what's in the news right now, You know, there was a piece today just saying that this months-long effort to dismantle Syria's chemical weapons has ground to a halt. And although the Syrian regime has given back, has turned in to the OPCW all but 8% of its declared chemical stockpile, they've now halted as of Sunday. They're not turning in the rest that they have. And apparently this is because of a dispute over what to do with the buildings and the tunnels that they've been stored in. And the Syrian government doesn't want to destroy those. The OPCW wants them destroyed. Also, in the last week, we've seen reports about a possible chlorine or ammonia gas attack on civilians, including children. And some of you may have seen a really impressive Telegraph, UK newspaper investigation that seemed to prove through medical analysis that chlorine was actually used. We now have the UN possibly investigating that, and we have US officials also confirming to some media that they do believe chlorine was used, but there's the entire problem of, if you acknowledge that, how do you remove all stocks of chlorine and ammonia, a common cleaning agent, from Syria? So I want to start off with Ambassador Huff and ask you, has this been a success or a failure? The notion to, once Syria crossed the red line and Obama decided not to use military strikes, but instead to have this peace effort with Russia that was declared a victory by the Obama administration to remove chemical weapons, success or failure?
Well, Indira, thanks. If you'll permit me, first, I'd just like to say what an honor it is to be with you here at the FDD. This is an organization that goes beyond decency and honor and actually engages in practicality, which in Washington, D.C. is sometimes a rare quantity indeed. It's a mixed record on the chemical weapons agreement. If it's fully implemented, if everything is taken out, if the capability is totally neutralized, this is something that will be good for the people of Syria and for all of Syria's neighbors. Okay? For this kind of weaponry, for this kind of capability, to be in the hands of the kind of regime headed by Bashar al-Assad is the definition of danger for one and all. Nevertheless, last September, when our president, in essence, traded in the credible threat of military strikes on Syria in response to the chemical weapons atrocity of August 21st, a very, very high price indeed was paid. It has enabled this regime to buy time, secure in the knowledge that it would not be attacked by the United States, and it has enabled it to double down on a humanitarian campaign, a terror campaign for which there just are not adequate words to describe. There is adequate data. The Commission of Inquiry, reporting to the UN Human Rights Council, has accumulated a lot of data. There are other organizations that have accumulated a lot of data. At the very best, if Bashar al-Assad is able to survive in that part of Syria that's important to Iran, Western Syria, he will nevertheless spend the rest of his days on this earth under a dark, dark, dark judicial shadow. I believe that someday this character, if he survives, is going to stand trial for what he's done.
Before we go on, I just wanted to say I am going to leave time for questions so that everyone can participate, but I know it's never possible for everyone's question to be asked. So what I'd like to do is invite you to tweet to me questions that you have. And my Twitter handle is @Indira, INDIRA_L. And feel free to tweet them to me. You can include the handle of follow FDD and the hashtag, and I'll look through the questions during the Q&A and try to summarize some of them so that everyone's voice will get in there in a summarized fashion. So back to Fred. I wanted to move on by asking you about, what's the next step? We talk about where we are right now. with Syria and how there's a chance that Assad may stay in power. And in fact, as you know better than we do, there are some people suggesting that the U.S. should just get used to the fact that Assad is here to stay, that he's winning and he will win, and that, perhaps the most practical course of action is to restore relations with his regime and engage on that level. What do you think about that?
Well, Indira, I think on a basic political level, that option is very impractical. I cannot imagine any American administration, this one or its successor, going back to business as usual with Bashar al-Assad and his family. I mean, the indictable elements are just too long and too striking. I think it would, as a practical matter, it would be politically unsustainable for any American administration to do business with this guy. In terms of what's next, look, our administration is still sort of trapped in a sense of skepticism that there is anything at all useful that the United States can do. I personally think this is profoundly unfortunate, although, having worked on Syria back in 2011 and 2012 as a government official, I know how hard the options are, how hard the choices are. This is a quintessential problem from hell. But the administration does not have a clear way forward. There is no overarching strategy, in my view, designed to implement what the President of the United States said on August 18th, 2011, namely, Bashar al-Assad should step aside. I'm a bit old-fashioned, perhaps, on these matters, but I believe that when the President of the United States says something like this, it is directive in nature. This is not an analytical comment. This is the Commander-in-Chief of the United States of America speaking. And I think what's merited here is a national security objective and strategy designed to bring this about and to see this corrupt and brutal clan in Syria replaced by something decent. Is this easy? Is this light lifting? No, far from it. But if we're not going to make the effort, we shouldn't be surprised to see American allies and friends in the region increasingly swamped by the humanitarian abomination this crew is producing.
Well, you had the opportunity to directly advise both the President and the Secretary of State until fairly recently. Now that you're out and you can tell us publicly what you said, on a nuts and bolts level, we keep seeing reports about, U.S. weapons and whether it would be right to arm the rebels or not. And we've seen reports about U.S. anti-tank weapons being in the hands of Syrian rebels. Is this true? Is it a good idea? Is it a disaster waiting to happen?
Yeah, Indira, on the first part of your comment, first let me say that I've been out of government, out of the Syria business since the last week of September 2012. A few weeks before that, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff all went to the President and said, Mr. President, what we're seeing in Syria is not good. It looks like the Iranians and Russians are doubling down for Assad. We're beginning to see the first indications of an al-Qaeda presence in certain ungoverned, non-regime areas. Our recommendation is that we do something significant to arm the Free Syrian Army. That was the recommendation. The President turned it down. Now, my view is that if that recommendation had been accepted and implemented in August 2012, we'd be in a different and better place right now in Syria. So the question now is, what is happening? Is it too little, too late? And we really won't know. There are credible reports all over the press, all over Facebook, of TOW missiles, obviously of U.S. origin, being in the hands of what is left of the armed nationalist Syrian opposition. I think this is a good move. Okay? Whether or not it will prove to be important, much less decisive, depends on what happens next. If this is just the checking of a box designed to appease the Saudis, who are really angry at the U.S. approach to Syria, then it won't amount to much. If it is the beginning of a real effort to expand the sway of Syrian nationalists, to enable them to fight, frankly, again, not light lifting, but fight in two directions: against the regime and its Iran-supplied militias, and against al-Qaeda. If that's what we're seeing, it's all to the good. And we won't know if it's too little, too late for quite a while.
Brief answer on this last question. What about the concerns that those U.S. weapons could fall into the hands of extremists and ultimately be used against us? We had some of those concerns with, shoulder-fired missiles in Libya getting on the loose. Certainly with al-Qaeda in Pakistan and Afghanistan, some of the weapons they were using dated back to the Mujahideen times when the CIA was supporting the Mujahideen.
I think, Indira, most of those concerns do come to focus on the issue of man-pads, portable anti-aircraft, shoulder-fired missiles. To the best of my knowledge, they're not going in. But look, I mean, I'm a former military officer. In any kind of an operation like this, if you want absolute perfection, don't even go there. Don't even go there. If during the Second World War we had demanded that there had to be 100% accountability of everything airdropped into occupied France, French resistance would have been nowhere. These operations are, by their very definition, complicated and imperfect. That in itself seems to dampen the appetite, frankly, of the White House to consider some of these things. But as a practical matter, if we're looking for perfection, forget it.
All right, we'll come back to all of those issues in the Q&A. I'd like to move on for some perspective at the maybe 30,000 feet level from Bruno, who is...
Do I need to take off?
Don't take off. Stay with us. But give us some broad perspective to tie some of these issues together as a bridge to the Iran case. As an advisor to the French government, as a full-time think tanker also, and writer, scholar, I'd like you to give us a sense of how much you think Western policies, both at the White House and in European governments, are actually led, in a way, reactively by rogue actors. Should we be taking our own positions first, or are we forced to follow around on the nose because we're having to react to what Syria does, Iran does, Russia does? Can we try to do something prospectively rather than reactively?
We can try, but Western democracies, by definition, will always think more short-term and be always more reactive than proactive and forward-looking, by definition. That's the price of being, that's a small price to pay for being democracy. By the way, thank you for mentioning Russia, because as a European, when I saw the title of this round table, I thought Russia 3 times. Why? Because, as a European, for me, who is the quintessential rogue state today? That's Russia, which is breaking all the rules. Not only the rules which have been established in 1991, but the rules which have been established in Europe by the mid-70s. Now, Russia is also trying to create a failing state in Ukraine. And Russia has always considered that the West is its sworn enemy. There has been no reset in Moscow. So when I saw the title of that panel, the three topics that were mentioned, I immediately thought Russia. But it's a short walk from Russia to Syria, unfortunately. And let me say a couple of things about Syria. First of all, I need to emphasize that fateful Saturday when President Obama called President Hollande and say, look, basically nothing's going to happen, it was a real shock. It was a real shock in Paris. And that drives me to emphasize the importance of US leadership of this kind of initiatives. Of course, the French could have taken off. We had a dozen planes ready with cruise missiles and all that. We had the flight plans were ready. The planes were actually literally on the tarmac ready to take off. Now, we could have done something on our own, but I'm not sure it would have been worthwhile. So in the absence of US leadership, frankly, in these sort of circumstances, we can't do much, even though we were highly motivated to do it. Syria is showing every day, especially over the past weeks, that it is a rogue actor in the sense, in many ways of the term. Look, one of the really specific characteristic of democracies is that we try to avoid casualties, we try to avoid what the military call collateral damage. Assad is actually seeking to maximize collateral damage. We've seen, I'm not sure he actually needs the remnants of his chemical weapons arsenal. He uses chlorine, which is technically speaking not a chemical weapon in the conventional sense. He uses barrel bombing, all that to maximize casualties. That's typically rogue behavior. One final thought about Syria. One of our main concerns in Europe is the thousands of young men and women, but mostly men, who go to Syria, participate one way or the other in jihadi groups, and then come back to Europe. The numbers are actually staggering now. One of our good allies, not a European one, but a distant one, mentioned that for his country, recently, I got this number last week, it was 2,000 people who have been there and which may return. So
And
state
you can't
number
tell
one.
us which country that is?
Well, it was a private conversation, but it's one of the Five Eyes. That's the first concern that we have. That doesn't take away, the moral imperative is also very important. But we really have, as Europeans, a combination of direct material interest at stake, jihadi terrorism coming back to haunt us, and moral imperatives. And for me, our policies on Syria cannot distinguish between these two. We do have to take these two imperatives, these two interests into account.
Okay, you raised the question of United States leadership and a sort of Western imperative, a responsibility of the West to do something about failed states and rogue actors. So we look at polling that's been done about United States leadership, and what's your vision from, there's been polling here and also in Asia. We've seen some polling on the eve of President Obama's trip, concerns among some of our Asian partners that after the president made his statement about the red line, looked like he was going to strike in Syria, then didn't, that some of our Asian allies have doubts about whether he would keep to his promises about protecting alliances if China were to move in the island disputes. So what's the view from Europe? What could the United States be doing better, or is it really collective leadership? Is it the US plus its European partners who should be giving some sort of collective moral partnership?
Of course, it is collective leadership, but there's no alternative to a US impetus. Europe operates in a way that you cannot have French or German or British leadership over Europe for military operation and strategic initiatives. Sometimes you can have UK-French leadership. That happens, what happened in Libya, for instance. But again, there's no alternative to US leadership. Now, to the credit of the American administration, I'm usually a critic of the American administration, but its credit, I think President Obama has been trying to restore the credibility of its security commitment. For instance, during his trip to Japan, mentioning explicitly that the Senkaku's Islands were actually covered by the US guarantee. That was a clear red line. Some would say another one. But I think that when you draw that kind of red line, it's a very strong message to China. Now, the problem is that the image of the United States today is such that despite sometimes the best of intentions, and I think President Obama has been also trying to restore the credibility of US military threat against Iran, for instance. But despite the best, whatever your best intentions are, if your image, if the perception of your policy is so damaged, there's only so much that you can do to convince both your enemies and your friends that you mean business. You know, there is a saying in the extended deterrence business, that is the protection given by Western countries to friends and allies, that it's actually about 90% reassurance and only 10% deterrence. That the most important component and the hardest part is to actually convince your friends and allies that you are here for them. And I'm afraid that today, neither the US nor the West in general is doing a very good job at that.
All right, but let's just if we could briefly answer the question of maybe the lesson learned among some administration officials. I don't think there are that many people in the White House or very close to the president who wish that he had launched a strike in Syria. I think they're in agreement in the White House. So the question is, I've heard from some administration officials that what they wish is that he had never drawn the red line explicitly. And so here's my question as it relates to Russia. Has the United States and the Obama administration sort of mended its ways by essentially making clear that there is no military action coming, even if Russia crosses over into Ukraine, and it's sanctions, which we'll be getting to shortly, that is going to be the weapon of force?
First of all, never improvise a red line. President Obama improvised a red line on Syria, and unfortunately the British and the French followed almost blindly. That was improvised. The red line that I was talking about for Japan is very different. So that's the most important thing. On Russia, I would say it's very strange. I have a very strange perception of American policies on Russia in the Ukraine crisis. The sanctions have been very elaborate, very well targeted. It's probably even our colleagues will say that, but that's probably something that they've learned from Iran. They've learned to do sanction, financial and personal sanctions, right. That's a benefit, a silver lining, so to say, of the Iran question. But at the same time, the language, the public language, including of the president, seems to me was fairly weak. Up until Vice President Biden's trip to Kiev, I thought that this did not give the impression of a very strong, committed administration. When you say things like, there will be costs, or there might be consequences, I'm not sure that Vladimir Putin is very impressed. Again, despite the fact that the actions themselves on the sanction front, the U.S. administration is to be commended for very well-targeted sanctions on the Russian leadership.
Okay. I'd like to move on to Iran because it's a favorite topic of mine, and we have two really well-informed people we're lucky enough to be able to hear from. Now, Ruel, as we know, a former CIA targets officer for Iran, a fluent Persian speaker and reader, you have a fairly unique ability to try to give us some insight to the extent that you think is possible into the thinking of the supreme leader and his government. Now, we keep hearing that in a way, Rouhani, whatever, doesn't matter. It's the supreme leader who's really the decider and who's going to make the decision about whether or not Iran moves towards a nuclear weapon. If it has the capability even to do so after these negotiations are over, we'll see. So I want to start by asking you, do you think that the supreme leader, we know that the national intelligence analysis that the U.S. did, the last one that was made public, stated that as far as U.S. intelligence knew, no decision had yet been made by the regime to go for a nuclear weapon. What is your assessment from all the reading you do of Iranian papers, materials, and get us into the head of the supreme leader to the extent that's possible?
That's a good question. First, I'd just like to say that these lights are brighter than anything I ever used as a case officer in the service. I actually think certain Democratic members of the Senate Intel Committee would find this constitutes torture.
We want to keep everybody honest here. Everybody given the right answers.
The only other thing I would say about, the American intelligence community, there's no bloody way they would know. whether the Supreme Leader has, made the decision to.
So you include yourself in that?
I would
as a
include
former-
myself in that, unless we were incredibly lucky or the Supreme Leader were incredibly loose-lipped on his mobile phone. I suspect neither is the case. I just think you have to use common sense. I mean, a country like the Islamic Republic hasn't spent 3 decades and billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars to develop a nuclear weapons potential, then not to do it. I mean, if I were to do that in sort of contemporary American culture, I would be like you got to third base with Scarlett Johansson and you decided not to go home. I mean, it's just not credible. Of course he's going to go for the nuke. When he decides to go for the nuke, I don't know. But that he is going to go for the nuke is just a foregone conclusion. And I mean, it is a revolutionary Shiite regime. I mean, they're fairly honest and straightforward about their intentions. Now we can, deceive ourselves about that. We can look at someone like Rouhani, who I would has actually been fairly consistent in his views too. And I would argue that one of his great legacies will be that he is one of the primary players and principal players of delivering a nuclear weapon to the Islamic Republic. And I think he will be quite proud, and rightfully proud, of the role that he will have played in that task when it's accomplished. And that's not to say that there aren't great differences inside of the Islamic Republic on many different issues, that there aren't important struggles inside of the Islamic Republic on different issues, and that the Revolutionary Guard and Rouhani, for example, really dislike each other rather intensely. But on the issue of the nuclear weapon, of getting the nuclear weapon, I think he and the Supreme Leader are more or less eye to eye.
All right. What about the whole question of whether it even would make sense? Let's assume that the Iranian regime even got to the point where it did have a nuclear weapons capability, and we can leave it on the table whether it's a question of a screwdriver's turn away, as some people refer to it, or actually more. We know that the U.S. administration has said many times, and every U.S. administration has said, they won't let Iran actually get a nuclear weapon. But let's leave that theoretical at the moment. Do you think that it would make any sense at all for Iran to use a nuclear weapon? Because, of course, our big fear is its use. And, some countries like Pakistan and India secretly came up with their nuclear weapons. Nobody was happy about it. Now, the question is, can Iran be contained if that were to go in a worst-case scenario of getting the capability?
Again, I think if Iran gets the nuke, the only one who's most likely to be contained will probably be us. I mean, I don't know. I would say that the odds of the Iranians using a nuclear weapon against the United States or Israel are pretty small.
Because it would be suicidal?
Because they are well aware of the nuclear capacity, particularly of the United States, and that they don't have any desire to send themselves to oblivion. But that doesn't mean that the utility of a nuclear weapon isn't enormous. It doesn't mean that it doesn't change the strategic calculations in the region. It doesn't mean, I actually think they believe, even though there's no historical reason to believe that, they believe that actually having a nuclear weapon will make them stronger vis-a-vis internal dissent and the constant Western cultural invasion that the Supreme Leader finds, I think, to be actually the greatest challenge to his regime. I think in his mind, the whole panoply of his defense against this includes a nuclear weapon, even though, if you looked at the Soviet Union, obviously the possession of many, many nukes didn't protect the Soviet Union from collapse.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I mean, very briefly, though, that brings us to the question of, that if Iran were to take that path, it would certainly be showing supreme hypocrisy to its people and to the world after having insisted all this time that it has no interest in having a nuclear weapon. So in a way, the question is, how would it be able to wield that perceived power of having the weapon if it's said all along, no, we don't want one, we don't want one? How do you see that playing out?
Well, that one, I think, it plays out fairly easily. I mean, the Supreme Leader even made a remark in a recent speech that he said, you know, not only does Iran need to have all the most advanced technical weapons, we need to have also strong faith. So just reverse that. We need to have strong faith. We need to also have those, you know, those technical weapons. And so I think the day that they decide to go for the nuke, he's just going to say, listen, we can't protect ourselves. We cannot protect Islam, the faith, without having that nuke. And obviously, the United States has done a rather poor job, so have certain European countries who've been struck by Iranian terrorism, in forcefully responding to that terrorism when Iran was a non-nuclear state. I think it's just reasonable to assume that once they go nuclear, we'll have even greater difficulty building up the willpower to respond to any type of unconventional strikes. And I do think that since Bruno's here, I'll say the frisson of them going nuclear after the West, and particularly the United States, has said, under no circumstances are we going to allow you to go nuclear, the joy, the happiness that will occur, that will be there, I think will be quite intoxicating for the revolutionary regime. And I would expect them to actually be much more aggressive and to do stupid things in the same way that Pakistan, when it got the nuclear weapon, almost got themselves into a very bad shooting war with India. I think that's the more likely scenario.
All right, we'll come back to all this in the Q&A, I'm sure. Now I want to move on to my favorite pet topic, sanctions, and roll up our sleeves with Mark, who, as many of you know, is the architect of many of the sanctions that we have against Iran right now, who advised Congress on how to draft that legislation and has also advised Treasury and the White House on his opinions about sanctions. So, Mark, I want to get straight to the point. The administration has said that the point of sanctions was to bring Iran back to the table, to force Iran to negotiate because it was suffering so much economically. So Iran came back to the table. It made a deal that, although it was not a complete deal, it was only a first step deal. They don't even call it a partial deal. It was a first step towards a complete deal. That was historic. Nobody thought that was possible in 3 rounds of negotiation over 6 weeks. So why not just take a bow? Why not say, I did it, sanctions are working, we're keeping them at the table, we're going to force them to have and make all these concessions? Or if you think that they're not working, is it because, you know, some critics of sanctions have said, well, the real goal of these sanctions in the minds of some people is to bring about regime change. They want to collapse the Iranian government through destroying its economy, and it's not really just about getting them to the negotiating table because they can't be trusted in a negotiation. So where are you on that spectrum?
Well, Indira, first of all, I mean, the real credit for these sanctions goes to Congress and the administration, and, you know, those of us in the think tank community, we obviously provide ideas and research, but, you know, the real architects are on the Hill and in the White House and in the Treasury Department and in the State Department. Second, the goal of sanctions is not to get Iran to the table. The goal of sanctions...
That's what the administration has said, to get them to negotiate.
The goal of sanctions is to get a good deal that stops Iran from ever developing a nuclear weapon, right? I mean, if we want to get the Iranians to the table, there are lots of ways we could have gotten them to the table. We could have bribed them to the table. We could have brought them to the table and promised them that you know, we would back down on all our strongest negotiating positions and fall away from all our red lines, and they would have happily come to the table. We brought them to the table, and economic sanctions played a major role in this, and the goal of getting them to the table is to get a nuclear deal, a peaceful nuclear deal, that stops Iran's ability to develop a nuclear weapon, to blocks their uranium pathway and their plutonium pathway, and make it very, very clear to this regime that if they try to pursue nuclear weapons through economic pain and through the credible threat of military force, the United States of America will not allow that to happen.
All right, well, we've heard President Obama, Secretary Kerry, Wendy Sherman, all of them say that the United States will never accept a bad deal, that no deal at all is better than a bad deal. So if that is their operating premise, we have, you know, 6 months up to the 20th of July, and then potentially another 6 months if they extend to try to get the best deal or to walk away from the table. So what is your concern at this point?
Look, my deep concern is that one day the Harvard Negotiating Project and Harvard Business School is going to study the Iranian nuclear negotiations as a case study. Right? And the case study is not about getting a yes. The case study is about how you accomplish your objective by saying 3 words: no, no, and no. Because that is the Iranian negotiating posture. 12 months ago, you were in Almaty, Indira. You were covering the nuclear negotiations at that point. And the administration's position was very simple. It was stop, it was ship, and it was shut. Right? That was the Almaty position. Stop all enrichment, ship all the enriched uranium, both 3.5% and 20%, out of the country, and shut down Iraq and Natanz and Fordow. Now, that was 12 months ago. 12 months later, fast forward, Iranians have been saying no, 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 and we're now down to, based on the interim agreement, we're now down to, well, stop half a stop the 20%, but you can keep going on the 3.5%. No more ship. We're down to oxidize and blend down the uranium, which is easily reversible. And now we're hearing reports that the administration is no longer insisting on shut. Well, certainly not on Natanz, because we've essentially acknowledged that the Iranians are going to have some limited domestic enrichment program. And that not on Iraq, where there's going to be some technical modification to Iraq that will limit plutonium reprocessing. And not on Fordow, again, this enrichment site buried in a mountain on an IRGC base, that maybe will end up as a facility for advanced centrifuge R&D. So really, in 12 months' time, we've gone from stop, ship, shut to half a stop, no ship, and no shut. And I say that the problem with that is that U.S. negotiating leverage is being squandered. We are diminishing our leverage, number one, by backing down as the Iranians declare things non-negotiable, and essentially acknowledging just because they declare non-negotiable, it's non-negotiable. And 2, we are diminishing our economic leverage, and we are doing that unilaterally. And the Iranian economy is experiencing a modest, albeit fragile, recovery. They are certainly, regardless of your specific calculations on sanctions relief, it is indisputable that compared to mid-2013, when the Iranian economy was being driven down, when oil revenue was being slashed, when the inflation rate was skyrocketing, where the real-dollar exchange rate was crumbling, where the Iranian economy had lost 5.5% in GDP between 2012 and into 2013, we de-escalated sanctions. We took off the pressure. And now President Rouhani can bring in a better economic team. They're more competent, but they're operating under significantly diminished economic pressure. They no longer have that significant risk of a balance of payments crisis and a foreign exchange crisis. They have more breathing room, more oxygen, and they're in a stronger negotiating position. And I'll conclude with this. We are in a position now in terms of a posture where we're no longer insisting on disclose and dismantle. No, we are in the posture now of essentially defer and deter.
Well, I know that the Obama administration would disagree with you on that because all these questions have been posed and they insist that's not at all our position, that our position remains strong.
Right.
And we, they say that they are not going that they're not going to concede anything on Iraq, that they're not going to concede on Fordow, et cetera. The one thing they have publicly signaled that they would eventually, they feel, probably have to concede on is some extremely limited, extremely closely monitored, under total verification, limited enrichment program. So let me ask you this. If the Obama administration gets everything they want, but they have to concede on that, allowing some small amount of domestic enrichment under total UN safeguards, could that be declared a victory if they manage to shut down everything else?
Look, I would certainly suggest that nobody declare victory. Because this is going to be a long, long process. If we get a deal, I would suspect that we are going to spend years trying to get the Iranians to continue to verify their compliance. So don't declare victory, don't pop the champagne, or you're going to wake up with a serious hangover. I think that the fundamental problem here is that there is no technical algorithm that solves a strategic problem. The strategic problem is the nature of this regime. And I don't care how fancy the technical algorithm is. I don't care what you do inside the box of their declared facilities, how you handle centrifuges and enrichment in Iraq and Fordow, what kind of safeguards regime you put in place inside the box. Iranian record, the regime's record of decades of nuclear mendacity suggests that what Iran will do as it cheats inside the box is that more likely it will develop clandestine facilities outside the box. Now, the only way you can try and minimize the risk of that is you have to set up a verification and inspection regime that it gives the IAEA unfettered access to any place they want to go in Iran.
So what about today? Now, as a result of the interim deal, they have daily, anytime they want, snap inspections in all
No,
the
but
facilities.
the problem is those inspections, this does not go anywhere unfettered access. This is very specific in their declared facilities.
those declared facilities.
Now, if Iran does not come clean on decades of nuclear mendacity, if they do not come
So
clean,
Parchin on PMD, on potential, on possible
all of that,
military
and forget about Parchin number 1, because Parchin number 1 has been sanitized. All right, we're talking Parchin 2,
Although
3,
if it were
5,
totally
and 10.
sanitized, why not give access to
Well,
it?
listen, I have my own theories. I think that ultimately the Iranians are going to pull Parchin out of their pocket at the last minute, table it. Everybody will declare success in terms of Iranian transparency. They've turned over a new leaf. IAEA goes in there, finds it sanitized. But the Iranians have gained the strategic communications advantage of showing that they're committed to transparency. And the reality is it's not about Parchin 1. It's about Parchin 8, 10, and 15.
The ones that we don't know about.
The
you're
ones we
saying.
don't know about. And you cannot design a verification and inspection regime that deals with a fundamental problem that keeps our administration officials awake at night, which is Iranian breakout in clandestine facilities, unless the IAEA has the opportunity to meet with all Iranian officials, get the documentation, get the full disclosure, find out where all the weaponization took place, and then get unfettered access, not with inside the box, but outside the box.
All right. Well, it sounds like you don't trust our intelligence community
No,
to know
I-
if
listen,
there
it's not that I
are
don't trust the intelligence
clandestine
community, it's that the
facilities.
Pentagon-
I don't trust them.
That's why I wanted to turn to Ruel.
Listen, look,
I mean, Fordo obviously had already existed before we knew about it. And, on that day when the American, British, and French leaders all came out together and said, we know about Fordo, obviously Fordo existed at that point. So they must not have known about it when it was being built. So I guess that's my question.
The
Do you not
Pentagon
trust-
Science Board, I believe that's the name, has had a report out, an excellent report, talking about, essentially an assessment of the United States' ability to detect nuclear weapons programs and nuclear weapons breakout. And according to this Pentagon report, we do have a lousy track record of detecting nuclear programs and nuclear breakout. And so it's not a question of not trusting the intelligence community. These are hardworking professionals. You heard from Mike Hayden today. It's a question of it's very difficult to know what you don't know. And Iran has been very adept, as we know over the years, at building clandestine facilities. And we only learned about them when it was too late. And that's the real fear. The real fear is we are all basically betting the farm on an IAEA inspections regime that's going to solve this problem. But we will never know whether this is actually the solution to this until we fundamentally know what did Iran do for decades, where was it weaponizing, and
All
we
right,
want
so
full access.
coming clean on everything. All right, let's turn to Q&A, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 3 questions together so that we can try to get more in, and try to keep your question a question, not a public declaration or speech, so that we can give these folks a chance to give us some answers. Yes, sir. And please identify yourself and your organization. Do we have a microphone for this gentleman in the front row? Okay, there's one coming.
Thank you very much. I'm Dr. Nisar Chaudhry with the Pakistan American League. Since many years, USA had been saying all options are on the table. Many countries want this negotiation to fail, several of them. What is your prospects and hopes about the success of these negotiations? Because there are tremendous stakes for both the countries and the globe in these negotiations.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we'll hold that question, and that's basically, do you want the talks to succeed or fail? I'm going to give it to the two of you. Okay, we have a lady back there, the blonde lady in the polka dots.
Claire
Please
Lopez with the
identify
Center
yourself.
for Security Policy. Question for the panel is, what about Syria's biological weapons inventory and arsenal? Even if the chemical weapons have been taken care of, we know they have very advanced weaponized smallpox, plague, et cetera.
Okay, good. That's going to be for Fred. And one last question, very quickly. That lady back there with her hand eagerly up.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Please
Yeah,
identify.
Marjan Greenblatt from Alliance for Rights of All Minorities in Iran. I want to know, when are we going to start talking about human rights?
Okay.
It's wonderful that we're in detail discussing the
Good.
nuclear issues, but
We'll give that to Bruno.
Human rights.
All right, quickly. Do you want the talks to succeed or fail?
Sure, I want the talks to succeed. I mean, I've been a strong supporter of the administration's Iran policy since 2010, and I believe that sanctions were a coercive instrument of statecraft that provides negotiating leverage with the ultimate goal of a peaceful resolution of this problem. We need an agreement. We need a good agreement. But I am deeply skeptical that we're going to get a good agreement based on already the record of this administration in backing down on key nuclear red lines.
Ruel, quickly.
Yeah, I mean, if the purpose of the negotiations is to prevent Iran from having the capacity to build nuclear weapons, I mean, who's not in favor of that? But I think it's sort of self-evident.
Bruno, human rights in Iran.
The dilemma that we face is that it proved impossible to have any kind of grand bargain with that regime because of the very nature of the regime. So up until 2005, the Iranians were talking about grand bargain. Then they were not interested anymore. Grand bargains meaning addressing other issues than nuclear issues. Then, last year, the supreme leader said, okay, you can negotiate the nuclear program, but that's all. That's all. So, we were faced with a choice. Either we accept these terms, that is
Even though
only
we were the ones who before said it's only going to be nuclear. Remember when Iran wanted the talks to also be about Syria, about regional integration, about Afghanistan?
Yes,
we
but
said
that
no, they
only
have
through
to
the
be.
pressure and sanctions did we lead them to say we want these talks on the nuclear program and
Right.
only on the nuclear
But
program.
you're
So
saying
there's a
good or
convergence
bad?
of interest between the P5+1 and Iran that these talks need. If we want them to succeed, they have to focus on the nuclear.
Just about nuclear.
Just about it. So it's not that we forget about human rights. It's that even if there's the slightest chance, I agree with my colleagues, I'm very skeptical also, but if we want these talks to succeed, they have to focus
So
only on the nuclear
get a
program.
deal first, get a good nuclear deal first, and then deal with things like missiles, proliferation, human rights, essentially?
If you ask me for a quick answer, that's not the way I would put it, so.
All right, put it your way.
No, I mean, you can't put missiles and human rights in the same box, okay? We need a broader strategy vis-a-vis Iran. I would just say that I'm troubled by the fact that many in the United States and in Europe would like, I mean, if there was a nuclear deal, there would be such a great sigh of relief that people would be ready to forget a lot about Iran's human rights record. At the same time, if we send the message that we are really aiming for regime change through the negotiations on the nuclear program, then there's not going to be a deal on the nuclear program. It's a real conundrum, but certainly, I mean, nobody wants, none of the big Western governments wants to completely brush aside human rights, obviously, but that's not an issue we can deal with right now through the same process.
So it's a delicate line to not
Very
upset the
difficult.
talks, but to be able to address those issues
Yes,
as well.
absolutely.
Fred, what about the lady's question on biological
Yeah,
weapons?
I'm almost certain that there is a biological weapons capability in the hands of this regime. It may be that the questioner knows more about the specifics of it than I do. I've read disjointed reports, really, over the last couple of decades. This is not something that's been cooked up in the last 20 minutes. What I do know for sure, and the chemical weapons capability proves the point, is that this regime will stop at literally nothing if it believes it has instruments that can enhance the terror of its victims. The chemical weapons that have been, I mean, the red line was crossed somewhere between 12 and 14 times before the big incident of last August. That weaponry was used not in a strategic sense, not in the sense of clearing large areas for ground troops to move into, but to enhance the terror of the victims. So to the extent this regime has other exotic capabilities in its bag of tricks, I'm not at all confident that it will refrain out of any sense of ethics or morality.
We have 1 minute left of airtime, guys. So any brief thought that any one of you didn't get a chance to share that you think is really important?
Well, I mean, I just want to make a comment just on sanctions, because it's coming up all the time. You know, it's our response to Russia, it's our response to Iran, it's our response, in some respects, to North Korea and Syria. You know, the sanctions industry in Washington is now replacing the peace processing industry as the most largest, vibrant, and certainly self-perpetuating industry we've got in Washington. You know, David Sanger, I think, described the U.S. Treasury Department and OFAC in particular as President Obama's favorite non-combatant command. I think we're in a situation right now where our automatic resort to coercive statecraft is sanctions. And sanctions are, you know, are never a silver bullet. They cannot work in isolation. They can do damage to economies, but they cannot work in isolation. They have to be married with other instruments of coercive statecraft. And on Russia, when the president just takes off military support for the Ukraine military off the table right away, when we allow our red lines on military action to be crossed 14 times, 15 times, where we erode the credibility of our military threat, and when Ali Khamenei doesn't believe that we're serious about destroying his nuclear facilities if he breaks out to a bomb, sanctions are not going to work. They're not going to be an effective instrument, and we are going to ultimately find ourselves one day without any effective coercive instruments of statecraft.
All right, well, that was terrific. I certainly learned a lot from all of you. I hope everyone else did.